Hey guys, it's Chelsea from The Financial Diet, and this week's video is brought to you by Skillshare. And as you probably noticed, today I am here with a very special guest. If you are someone who reads about money a lot online, you may already know her, but if not, this is Stefanie O'Connell. She is an author, a speaker, a financial expert, and she also happens to be my neighbor and friend. So obviously Stefanie is someone who knows a lot about many different areas of money, but she's also someone who happens to be freshly engaged. Congratulations. So I thought I would take this as an opportunity to talk about kind of the intersection of money and relationships, or more specifically, money and marriage.
That's a big question.
Stefanie is someone who's actually made some pretty interesting choices around her own engagement and marriage.
Yeah, you could call them interesting.
Which I think we could all learn from. So today I'm going to talk with Stefanie and with you guys about the 5 questions that you should ask your partner before you get married. So number 1 is something that I think not enough people consider, and that is, what does getting engaged look like to you? So Stefanie, if you wouldn't mind explaining a little bit about your engagement and how it's so interesting.
Why it's so interesting. So the big thing is I gave back my engagement ring. And it wasn't because my fiance and I couldn't afford it. It wasn't because I think engagement rings are stupid. I don't think they are. They're just not something I personally value. So I don't really wear jewelry, if you might be able to tell. And so when I saw the engagement ring my fiance gave me, all I could think about was, besides getting married, was what else we could do with that money. So, you know, I would say my first thing is like, forget the rules and you do you. So in that vein, as soon as I got the ring and I was like, yes, I'll marry you, my second question was, so thank you so much for getting me this ring, but how would you feel if we returned it and then used the money to pay for the wedding or pay for the honeymoon or kind of work through our other goals? Because honestly, we have a lot of goals right now. We're obviously trying to get married, but we're also taking big career moves. We're thinking about maybe buying a house somewhere. We want to travel a lot. And so for us, it was about considering our engagement within the context of the start of our marriage.
Right. But I think the most important part is like really establishing upfront, what does a proposal and engagement look like for you? Because otherwise, the guy who's also not necessarily the person who should be proposing, I know several women who proposed to their male partners, but if he doesn't have anything to go off of, he's very likely to just like read that stuff online that's like, it has to be 3 times your salary and you have to, you know, organize this big event and all of that stuff.
And it's honestly a great opportunity to talk through one of your biggest purchases together, right? This is laying the foundation for the rest of your life. And if you can't kind of speak transparently about your value system around that first major purchase, how are you going to do that when it comes time not just to plan the wedding, but to plan the rest of your life?
Absolutely. And I think especially if you are looking at spending more than, 2 months' salary on this item, like that's a huge commitment for anyone. And quite frankly, I know more women who are like you who would have rather their partners spent less on it. And for what it's worth, there's no like one number that is too high. It is totally dependent on your relationship to that money and your partner's relationship. But taking the opportunity to really talk about what that time should look like means that A, everyone can get what they want, but also you're not stuck feeling like you have to live with something that isn't how you would have wanted to do it, or not an amount of money you're comfortable with spending, you know? And it shouldn't be coming at the cost of other things that you would prefer to do, which I think for a lot of people it is. But either way, having an open conversation about the process of proposing, what that moment should look like, or at least what it should not look like for a lot of people. Like if he had proposed to me via like Jumbotron or something, like I may have had to say no on principle, but just being super, super transparent about that, I think will allow you to not feel like you're trapped in any kind of mistake. And honestly, take it from Stefanie, even if you do get something that you feel uncomfortable with, like for example, if he spent an amount of money that you really feel uncomfortable justifying it, like you can have that conversation.
If he wasn't open to the idea of me saying, oh, I would like to exchange this for either something that's not quite as expensive, or I want to return it altogether, that could have been a red flag.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
If you feel like it would in some way call into question you wanting to marry him because you would want to spend less money on a ring, that is a huge red flag for your relationship, no offense. So similarly to that, the second question is, what does getting married look like to you? And this is something that, from my perspective, very, very few couples have an honest conversation about, and everyone would benefit from having. I know that you guys are sort of in the process of obviously the beginning stages of planning your wedding, and I can only imagine that the financial elements of it have already very much come into play. So what is that conversation like for you guys?
It was so wild to think we have been living together for 6 years. And now that we're getting married, it's weird, but it still feels like there's some major money decisions we still have to figure out, even though we've been negotiating this process financially together for years. And the first thing was, what is like the 5-year kind of plan? And it wasn't necessarily directly money related when we started having that conversation, but what I did after we returned the ring was say, so, beyond the wedding, because I think a lot of conversations are like, we're engaged, let's plan a wedding and set a budget. But it's, again, really hard to make those decisions without context. So I was like, let's just zoom out for a second and say, what do we want in the next 5 years or so? And we made a list of, places we want to go, of things we want to do, of career moves we want to make. And then we kind of tried to estimate price tags. Now, of course, we can't predict the future. We don't know what everything will cost. But by putting some numbers on paper and considering a broader picture of our lives beyond the next 9 months before we get married, we were able to start making our next step choices a lot more carefully and with consideration for not only each other, but our shared goals. And so that was huge for us. In terms of getting married, the second big thing that we were trying to figure out was logistics. So, really simple things. We've had separate accounts the entire time that we've been together, and we have one person on the lease, and that person acts as the landlord in our relationship, and it's worked for us. We split everything 50-50, and that's worked for us. But going forward, we are going to be sharing not only, our expenses, but our shared savings goals. And so there are accounts that we don't have in place that we need to put in place. I mean, I'm curious to hear if you've had any specific tools that have been effective for you in the logistics regard.
As far as the actual act of getting married, I think the biggest thing for us was to have that conversation completely sort of cut off from everyone else, because I think the biggest issue is that for so many people, especially if you come from, let's just say, a more traditional family, marriage quickly becomes either not as much about the couple or basically not at all about the couple and what they would want. And both Mark and I knew from the get-go that we wanted a very small wedding. It was less than 30 people. We wanted to not spend a ton of money. And also it was already logistically complicated enough being from two countries that we didn't want to, spend $1 that we didn't need to spend. My wedding dress was $80. Like, we really were super sort of clear-headed about what was and wasn't important, and anything that was even slightly less important, we were like, let's get rid of it. Who cares? When it comes to choosing the very, very foundational things, like how big is the wedding, how much are we willing to spend on it, you have to come to those conclusions as a couple before you bring other people into the conversation. And also, I find that you really have to kind of stick to your guns as far as what you thought it was going to cost. It is very easy for things to completely spiral out of control.
Yeah, that's been huge for us. So one of the biggest decisions we made was to pay for our wedding ourselves. And one of the reasons for that is it really helps us kind of push away other people's expectations, because when it's your money, you get to decide how to spend it. But because we're paying for the wedding, it's a little bit easier to put my foot down and be like, no, that's not in our budget. We're paying for it. We want to do it on our terms. So we're still trying to satisfy people, but at the end of the day, you're right. It comes down to what matters to us. And by being in a position where we're the financially independent people making those choices, it's easier to be firm about enforcing those choices.
Looking at your wedding, not just in the context of the wedding itself, but in a much broader context of what else you want in life, I think makes it much easier to really clarify what matters to you. You will never come to those conclusions unless A, you decide that nothing is unquestionable, that you must question every element of it and really decide, rather than starting from a point of you'll have it all. And more importantly, look at those sort of choices in the context of what else you could do with that money, as she said. Number 3 is perhaps a bit controversial for some, but I think it is extremely valuable, and it is, how do you feel about a prenup? And I'd love to hear about your experience with that.
Yeah, so because I own a business, the first thing we did after we got engaged was hire lawyers. And that's still not very romantic. I know you're all thinking like, first she returns a ring, then she's hiring a lawyer. But my fiance and I were both in our 30s. We've accumulated some assets. We have things that we want to protect, and we're also just really shamelessly practical, which I don't think is a bad thing. In fact, we find it really romantic to talk about these things, because talking about our financial goals and talking about what we're going to do with our money and how we're going to protect that money and that future with each other and ourselves is a value we both share. So it can be something that binds you together, and I think coming at it that way is probably a really good place to start. Now, I'm not saying you have to have a prenup. I would recommend it, even if you're not like us and you don't own a business. I still think it's a good idea. I love what my lawyer said, that like everybody has a prenup. Essentially, your assets are going to be divided according to the laws in the state in which you get married. So that is basically a prenup. It's just the one that you automatically agreed to when you got married, as opposed to the one that you and your fiance decided was best for you.
Totally. I actually, interestingly, so I, as you mentioned, own a business as well. And one of the things that we did before we got married, Mark took a sabbatical from work when we were first starting the company to help us set up the ad infrastructure, and he contributed quite a lot to TFD initially existing. So one of the things that I did was formally give him a small amount of ownership in the operating agreement of our company, because I think although it can seem superficial to some, you're married, your assets are shared, who cares? It was like, he deserves this completely independently of us being together. I would say absolutely no one, but maybe some people do, but let's say almost no one gets married thinking they're going to get divorced.
Yeah,
and there are enormous changes that happen in one's life that are completely unpredictable, you know, and it doesn't have to necessarily be acrimonious. Loving someone the day you get married is what everyone feels, and not loving that person, or rather not wanting to be married to that person at a future point, is not something anyone anticipates when they are getting married. I totally echo your sentiment that prenups are, I find, rather romantic. I actually wrote an article about it. I'll link you guys in the description. But I think they're very romantic because to me what they say is that I want you to have what you should have, whether or not we're together. And I think the idea behind prenups primarily are sort of doing as much as you can to prevent that ugly situation. Because when you hear about these divorces that take 4 or 5 years in court, most of the time it's because they're hashing it out over assets that they can't agree on. Unfortunately, prenups, maybe because of like movies and television, they're always portrayed as this really evil thing that rich people get, or that they mean, I hate to say it, but often it's portrayed as your husband doesn't love you, which is just dark, first of all. Also, why is it not the woman who's initiating it?
Right? Come on.
But I definitely think it's something that people should not dismiss out of hand, or think that you need to be ridiculously wealthy in order to do it.
Yeah, that's such a good point. It's not just about protecting what you currently have, it's also protecting what you're building towards in the future. And again, you don't know what that future is going to hold.
Totally.
In so many respects, financially, health-wise, children-wise. So this is all an opportunity also to get on the same page and talking through these things with your partner. Like we said before, when you make these decisions about your spending around the ring and the wedding, it also gives you an opportunity when you're talking about doing a prenup to get on the same page around how you feel about splitting your assets and sharing your future from a wealth standpoint, which is really, really important.
I think it's very important in general for people to get over their fear of these really scary conversations. I think a lot of people have this inherent fear that they're going to either not understand things well enough, or that it might make things ugly between you and your partner. And I think it's quite the opposite. I think being able to have these difficult conversations in a very open, honest, and value-neutral way makes a couple so much stronger. And the reality is we are all planning for a future that we can't imagine. So it's so much better to protect yourself now than to end up in a situation that you really don't want to deal with down the road. And the only way to protect yourself is to have these conversations now. Also, if you didn't get a prenup and you're like, well, too late, I'm already married, there are also postnuptial.
Yes. They might not always be really exciting conversations to have, but the more you do them, the easier they'll get, the more on the same page you're going to get, and the more it's going to strengthen your relationship, hopefully, in the long run.
So number 4 is to ask them, how do you manage money and what are your strengths and weaknesses with it? And I think that that is something that not enough people are able to be candid about, especially with one another. I have found it infinitely useful to have complete honesty with Mark about how I manage money and how often not great I am with it, and vice versa, in order for our relationship to be healthy. But I'm very curious as to what you think about this.
So my fiance, when we first met, was a big time spender, and I was super, super frugal. Like, I was afraid to spend money, and we have kind of helped each other become more of one another, but find this middle ground that's really great for our relationship. So I'm really happy because we've shared our weaknesses really honestly with one another, and it's allowed our weaknesses to help one another become strengths. I don't think that there's anything that's inherently like a deal breaker about your partner's finances. What I think is a deal breaker is an unwillingness to talk about it and an unwillingness to address it. So if, for example, if your partner has a lot of debt, I understand if you don't have debt, or if you're really proactive about paying down your debt, why your partner's debt that they're not addressing might be a red flag. I get that. But on the other hand, if you are willing to kind of share how you're tackling your debt, share what you're doing to make it a priority and why it's important to you, that can be an opening for a conversation that you can have with your partner, that doing this is really important to you, and then you can see if their behavior changes.
Totally.
So that, I think, is really the key, is being able to have the conversation and seeing if the behavior can be flexible.
I agree. And I think also it's so important to understand that, to your point, a weakness is not an inherent deal breaker. It's really whether or not you're willing to deal with it. And for some people, myself included, dealing with that problem is not necessarily becoming better at it. It's learning how to sort of get out of your own way and set up systems in which you cannot sabotage yourself. You know, learning how to stop yourself from becoming a burden, and or working to change these habits are both great options, but you have to be willing to do something about it. And if the other person is not willing to do something about it, or not willing to admit what they're doing, then you're going to be in a lot of trouble. You are really trusting that person that they're not going to do things that a lot of people do, like, for example, make a mistake financially and not tell you and try to cover it up.
Yeah, financial infidelity is real.
It's huge,
yeah, it's
especially
really
with credit cards.
I think a lot of that comes back to this idea of shame around personal finance, and it's really tough to share with the person that you are really love something that you feel a lot of shame about.
There are ways in which you can be someone who isn't great with money and still have a lot to offer to a relationship. You know, it's just about learning to counteract the things you see, and most importantly, be honest about them. So the last question is perhaps the most important, and I think that is, what is important to you financially? Because I think more couples than not either evade the question with each other or never really ask themselves. But I think that it's so crucial to be honest with each other about what you're actually looking to do financially with your life, and not just assume it's like the default setting of an adult life.
Or that you're gonna continue as you are.
Totally.
So where we have been up to this point in our life is probably not where we're going. In fact, my fiance and I have been speaking about this a lot recently, because we're like, are we going to continue to live in New York City? What is that keeping us from doing? What will it enable us to do if we leave? And what do we give up? And these are huge questions with huge financial implications. And I think like the first thing people think about is not necessarily the money side, but because money touches pretty much every decision you make, a really great way to just kind of start the conversation is kind of thinking through what the ideal scenario is.
There are an enormous amount of considerations that if you're not willing to be completely frank about, you can find yourself in a situation where you resent your partner because you feel like you are being prevented from doing what you would have done otherwise.
And I think more than love, honestly, I think a lot of this stuff comes back to respecting your partner and respecting your shared values and respecting that person's independence as much as you respect your shared future together.
But yeah, so just remember that no matter what your weaknesses are, or your differences are, or your goals are, nothing is impossible as long as you are willing to be totally honest about it and you're willing to make the effort to change. No matter what change looks like for you, you have to be willing to put in the effort for the other person as well as yourself. So thank you so much for being with us, Stefanie. We love you on the channel. You're welcome back anytime.
Yay,
we love
thanks
you.
for having me.
And also, I just wanted to give a little shout out to go follow her. Here's her social media handles. They'll also be in the description. Check her out. She's wonderful to follow. Tons of great information. and very cool to listen to, as you guys know now. And do remember that if and when you maybe are looking to settle down, that one of the best things you can bring to any relationship is a new and perhaps monetizable set of skills. And there is nowhere better to learn one than Skillshare. Skillshare is an online learning community with over 20,000 classes in design, business, technology, and more. And premium membership gives you unlimited access to high-quality classes on must-know topics so you can improve your skills, unlock new opportunities, and do the work that you love. Everything from editing your photos better to creating your very own website is at your fingertips. So join the millions of students already learning on Skillshare today with a special offer just for our viewers. Get 2 months of Skillshare for free. To sign up, visit the link in the description, and the first 500 visitors get 2 months of unlimited access to over 20,000 classes for free. Act now for this special offer and start learning today. As always, guys, thank you for watching, and don't forget to hit the subscribe button and to come back for new and awesome videos.